Today we're going to talk about the skin and the membranes of the body. This is Denise Hubble, respiratory therapist. You know, when I think about the skin, I think about this envelope that we have that sort of contains us and protects us. And that is some of the main things that skin does, but we're going to learn a little bit more here. When we look at the body membranes, we know that they cover our body surfaces, like our skin, for example. They line our body cavities, like in our mouth we have a lining, and we know that that's a wet lining. It has mucus on it. And also there are membranes that wrap around our organs and sort of support our organs. Our cutaneous membrane is also known as our skin. So there's our skin there. And our mucous membranes are tracts that are open to the outside of our body, like our mouth. We've already talked about has a lining inside that's wet. That's called a mucous membrane. And then there are membranes that don't open to the outside of our body. Think, for example, about your lungs. You're going to be talking a lot about these linings of your lungs called the parietal and the visceral pleura. Those linings don't open to the outside environment, do they? So they're inside, and those are called serous membranes. They're wet membranes as well. They contain a solution on those as well. And then another kind of quirky type of membrane would be synovial membrane, and that we find in our joints. True enough that skin is considered a dry membrane, but we should keep in mind that the surface of our skin is going to have some sebum and some sweat, so we're going to learn about that. And it does protect our body. And if we look at it really closely, we would see under a microscope that the epidermis has stratified squamous epithelium. So stratified means multi-layers. Squamous means flat, like little pancakes. So that's kind of the structure of the epidermis, and the epidermis is on the outermost edge, so epi is on the top. And then dermis is below that, and it's made of connective tissue, specifically dense fibrous connective tissue. You know, when I think about skin, I think about some of the patients I've seen, and especially I think about patients that have had extensive burns. And when these patients have a lot of burns, like for example, I've had patients that have been in fires in their garages, and they get a lot of burns on their chest and on their, like all over their thorax actually, some of the patients I've seen. And I noticed that they have a lot of leakage of fluid into the bed, and indeed they're very difficult to manage in terms of fluid management, because when you don't have that skin barrier, you basically leak out a lot of fluid. So we know that skin helps sort of keep all of our contents inside. Also, these patients I've seen have been very prone to infection because they've lost that barrier to the environment. So microorganisms can just simply go into their body so easily. So these patients need to be treated with such care. And what we often do as healthcare workers is put on gloves and put on a special sterile gown, and then put on a mask so that we don't bring our germs to the patient. So it really helps you understand that skin is one of our important protective mechanisms we have to protect ourselves from fluid loss and from microorganisms coming into our body. We often use the term mucosa when we refer to these mucous membranes. Again, we can think about our mouth that has a mucous membrane. So does our lungs. So does our gastrointestinal system, for example. So these are moist membranes. That probably makes sense to you, that they're lined with a fluid, and they are able to absorb. Think, for example, of your small intestine. We know that our small intestine is part of our digestive system, and it plays a big role in absorbing food particles. Also, we can think about secretion. Indeed, in the gastrointestinal system, there are all kinds of things secreted by the cells that line that gastrointestinal tract. And then if we want to look at how are mucous membranes built, so what are they made of? Well, they have an epithelial layer, so they have epithelium, and then they have loose connective tissue below that, also known as lamina propria. This is a great picture that solidifies that. So if we looked at a cross section of the esophagus, so the esophagus is a tube that runs from the pharynx down to the stomach, we see that there's a lumen on the inside, and that lumen isn't dry, of course, it's wet. And we call this type of tissue here mucosa. So the serous membranes, we're going to be learning lots about serous membranes. For example, the pericardium has two layers that wrap around the heart, and there's a parietal layer and a visceral layer. Parietal's on the outside, visceral's on the inside. In between them is some serous fluid. There should be no air in this area. It should just be simply serous fluid in there, just a small amount. One of the great things about this is that it reduces friction, so your heart can beat through your whole lifetime about 1 beat every 0.8 of a second. And so you can imagine we don't want to have friction in there. So that's what this does, having these two layers with a bit of serous fluid. If we look closely at how serous membranes are built, we would see that there is one layer of flat cells in the epithelium, and underneath that, areolar connective tissue. This is a great image showing some examples of the parietal layer and the serous fluid and then the visceral layer. So we know that this type of design is around the lungs, and we see that on the right. It's also around the heart, and we see that on the left. Imagine if a patient accumulates fluid in these areas. It would compress the organ inside, wouldn't it? For example, on the right, if this patient accumulates fluid in the space between the parietal and the visceral layers, that's called pleural effusion. And what it does is compresses the lungs. So your patient will actually say it's hard to take a deep breath when they have this accumulation of fluid around their lungs. This is a great picture for helping us understand how those layers relate to each other. So the parietal layers on the outside, the visceral layers on the inside, and a small amount of serous fluid in between. But look at how this image shows us that the parietal and visceral layers are continuous with each other. Just like the idea if you put your hand in a balloon, it does create two layers, but we see that they're continuous with each other at the wrist. Here are some of the serous membranes. We've talked about the pleura and the pericardium, but let's talk about the peritoneum. Well, in your abdomen you have lots of organs, obviously, things like your intestines, for example. So all of these organs, they have a layer around them, and then your abdomen itself has its own layer. So it's very similar design as what we've talked about. Parietal and visceral peritoneum. To look inside of your knee, we would see that there is a capsule that contains synovial fluid, and this capsule is malleable, soft. It is able to cushion the bones because it's able to absorb some of the forces when we jump up and down, for example. And that's what this talks about, synovial membranes. So synovial membranes do not have any epithelial tissue, strangely. They're just made up of some loose areolar connective tissue. And there is some lubricating fluid called synovial fluid, which is released and inside of the capsule. And like it says, it cushions our joints, for example. So we can take a look here at how there's a capsule containing synovial fluid. It allows really easy movement, and it cushions. Well, here it is, the integumentary system, also known as our skin. Who knew that it had so many functions for us? We've already talked about a couple of these functions, such as containing our organs, and it mentions here as well insulating and cushioning our organs, and then protecting our body. Now, under protection, we've already talked about the drying out idea. We don't want to dry out like a raisin, so we have the skin that kind of prevents that. And also it mentions microbes or bacteria. We already talked about that idea that, you know, our skin, when it's intact, it protects us against microorganisms kind of creeping into our body. Now think about if you place an IV. If you place an intravenous into a patient and leave the catheter there, what's happening is you've broken this barrier and you've put a little plastic tube basically into the body. All of these spots like IVs or art lines or picks and all kinds of different things where we introduce little um, things to the body and we have openings in the skin, we're really risking the chance of a microorganism entering the body because we've broken the skin. So you will see that whenever we have a patient that is in the hospital and they develop an infection, we have to consider that it could be caused by one of our IVs or art lines, etc., because we've broken that barrier of the skin. Okay. Also, I guess I'm working my way up from the bottom of the protection list. Our skin tries to protect our body from UV radiation, and we're going to learn about melanocytes and how they work that way, how they work to sort of fight sunlight. And our skin protects us from heat and cold, and from chemicals, and from mechanical damage, like when we bump ourselves on the edge of our desks. Also, our skin, oh yes, our skin is very involved with heat regulation, and we know this already because if we turned the heat up too high in our rooms right now and we looked in the mirror in about 20 minutes, we would see our skin is very flushed or red. And that would be because the skin wants to bring blood up to the surface of itself, of the skin, to allow heat to dissipate from the body or leave the body. So that's a way of cooling ourselves off. Also, and I should mention about sweat as well, that we will have some sweat form, and then when the sweat evaporates, it actually helps to cool us off. Also, if we get too cold, we'll notice that we have vasoconstriction in our skin, and we certainly won't look flushed then. We won't be looking very pink then. But we have vasoconstriction. All of our vessels kind of clamp off at our skin to try to retain our heat deep inside of our body. So what an amazing system this is. The skin is also involved with excretion of urea and uric acid. The kidneys do that also, by the way. And they're involved with the synthesis of vitamin D, which seems benign but is very important. And as Canadians, we need to kind of be aware that we're probably not getting as much vitamin D as we need in the wintertime particularly, because we tend to bundle up as we need to, and we need the skin to be exposed to sun in order for vitamin D to be synthesized. These two slides just add a little bit more detail on how those mechanisms work. So we're going to take a look at the structure of skin. So there are a couple tissue types. There's the epidermis and the dermis, and we'll be looking at those in big detail in the next slide, and then the hypodermis. So the hypodermis is also known as a subcutaneous layer. It's not actually part of the skin or integumentary system. There's lots of fat in there, so composed mostly of adipose tissue, and it's really able to cushion us from blows. So let's take quite a bit of time to review this important slide. So this is looking at the integumentary system. Let's start at the top. Of course, we have hair, so that's an accessory of the skin. And then we have the epidermis in brown. We see that. It's stratified squamous epithelial tissue, so many layers of flat cells. And then below that we have the dermis. And look at everything that's happening in the dermis. We have all kinds of structures we need to chat about in the dermis. But just as a little breakdown of the dermis, there's the papillary layer on the outermost side, and the reticular layer deeper to that. The papillary layer forms ridges, and this is what creates our fingerprints. The reticular layer is deeper to the papillary layer. So also below all of these structures, we have something else called the hypodermis, not part of the integumentary system, it's just below it. We've already said there's a lot of fat in there to cushion blows when we bump into our desks and chairs, and it's also known as the subcutaneous tissue. If you're having injections of some types of drugs, they are called sub-Q. They might be administered subcutaneously or sub-Q, so sometimes medications are injected into that area, that fatty area. All right, so looking over on the right-hand side, we see dermal papilla. They are the top surface of the papillary layer, which form our fingerprints. There are pores in the skin, which allow sweat glands to emit what they create or eject it onto the surface of the skin. And then some of the other appendages of the skin, the eccrine or sweat glands are coiled looking structures that are in tan on the right hand side. And they of course produce sweat, And then the erector pili muscle is an amazing muscle, which actually can make your hair stand on end when it contracts. So if you've ever been scared or really cold and your hair stands on end, we know it's the erector pili muscle that's responsible for that. And what it does is a couple of functions. When we make our hair stand on end, we create an insulating blanket of air to help keep us warm. So that helps when we're cold. Also, when we contract our erector pili muscle, it makes us look larger. So if we need to intimidate somebody, we could try that, just like how a cat could do that. Of course, it doesn't really play much of a role today, but next we have the sebaceous or oil gland, and we see that it is clustered around the hair follicle. So when you have greasy hair because it hasn't been washed, we can remember that the oil gland opens into the hair follicle. And then we have the hair root is inside the hair follicle, and of course that's where a strand of hair begins. Also, we see that there are lots of blood vessels here, arteries and veins, and there are nerve endings as well in this area. We have sensory nerve fibers, lamella, corpuscle, and we have also in the hypodermis, just a reminder, we have lots of adipose tissue. So that outermost layer that we talked about, it was in brown in the previous image, called the epidermis, stratified squamous epithelium. It's capable of being pretty hard and tough. Like think about the heel of your foot. That's a pretty thick, hard area of skin. The cell called keratinocytes actually produces keratin, and that's what helps make our skin kind of hard, tougher, I should say. This area is avascular. That means that there are no blood vessels. It's composed of 4 or 5 layers. Look at all the layers of epidermis of the skin. Starting from the deepest, so the most inside, they're labeled starting with stratum basale, for example. One thing I want to point out is that thick skin has 5 layers, all of these that are listed. Thin skin only has 4 layers because it does not have stratum lucidum. Interestingly, there are numerous test questions on this slide. So I wonder if this is thick skin or thin skin. Well, let's take a look. So it looks like it only has 4 layers. I see them spelled out on the right hand side of the slide. So I know that it must be thin skin. Like a really good example would be the skin on your eyelid is very thin, so it definitely would only have 4 layers. A couple of other things are shown here that we're going to be chatting about. Keratinocytes, a type of cell that produces keratin. Desmosomes we're going to be chatting about, and epidermal dendritic cells, and melanin and melanocytes. Melanocytes produce melanin, and I think of these as tiny little umbrellas, the melanin, because they protect your skin from the damaging UV light that we're exposed to, and it protects the tissues beneath it from UV getting into that area. Also, we have the epidermal dendritic cells. They're involved with recognizing threats like bacteria or viruses invading the area. And then Merkel cells are involved with sensing touch. We know that the dermis has 2 layers. The upper layer or more superficial layer would be the papillary layer, and the deeper layer is reticular. The contents of them are listed here. Other random things we have going on in the dermis would be that we have sensory receptors to tell our nervous system what's going on in our environment. We have phagocytes, which are cells that are able to engulf another cell. And random collagen and elastic fibers are throughout the dermal layer, and lots of blood vessels, arteries and veins and capillaries. Sebaceous glands produce oil, which can be released either into the hair follicle to coat the hair and make it soft and not brittle, or released directly onto the skin itself. The great thing about sebum, or the oil that is produced, is it helps to kill bacteria. Isn't that great? And we have our sweat glands, also known as sudoriferous glands. Of course, they produce sweat. There are 2 types, the eccrine and the apocrine. The apocrine actually empty into the armpits and into the genitals, so a little bit different. Last but not least, we have hair and the hair follicle, the erector pili, and our nails. So these are all sort of appendages of our skin or extensions of our skin, and this slide kind of sums them up. Thanks so much.